really don't know how long I was stabbed. I can tell you how it happened.
GeorgeBurns liked to begin by disarming people. He would shrug, tilt his head slightly, and say he didn't tell jokes, not really. Jokes had punchlines, he insisted. What he told were anecdotes, half-truths, exaggerations wrapped in memory, lies sometimes, and then, just as the audience leaned in, he would confess that even that was a joke. Or maybe it wasn't. That tension between truth and performance followed him for more than 8 decades, shaping a career that felt effortless on the surface but was built on hunger, improvisation, and an almost stubborn refusal to disappear. On stage, Burns moved with ease, cigar in hand, pausing just long enough to let silence do the work. Off stage, he was a man who never forgot where he came from or how close he once lived to nothing at all. By the time America knew him as the relaxed, elderly comic who seemed to have always been there, GeorgeBurns had already lived several lifetimes. He was born Nathan Birnbaum on January 20th, 1896, in a cramped apartment on New York's Lower East Side, an immigrant neighborhood dense with noise, sweat, ambition, and survival. His parents, Dora and Louis Birnbaum, were Jewish immigrants who had fled hardship in Eastern Europe, carrying old-world traditions into a city that moved faster than anything they had known. They raised 12 children in 3 small rooms, where privacy didn't exist and warmth came from bodies pressed close together more than from coal or blankets. Louis worked as a cane polisher, a job that paid barely enough to keep food on the table. Dora washed clothes for neighbors, her hands raw from soap and water. Meals were modest, sometimes painfully so. Potatoes, onions, bread if they were lucky. Yet George would later remember laughter filling that apartment, Yiddish jokes bouncing off the walls, and the way humor became a kind of currency when money ran out. That fragile balance collapsed in 1904 when George was 8 years old and his father died suddenly at 47. There was no safety net, no insurance, no cushion of savings. Overnight, childhood ended. George left school after the 5th grade and joined the street economy of the Lower East Side, shining shoes for nickels, selling newspapers, rolling cigars, doing anything that put a few coins in his pocket. He sang with a children's quartet called the Imperial Four, performing wherever they could, trusting promoters who sometimes vanished with their pay. On more than one night, George slept in alleyways, learning what real hunger felt like, what fear sounded like when the city finally went quiet. Those nights never left him. He carried them like a private education, lessons in resilience that later let him walk into unfamiliar rooms without flinching. As he grew older, his identity shifted constantly. At home, he was Natty. On the streets, he was Shoeshine Birnbaum. He watched burlesque performers sneak laughs out of tough crowds and studied how timing mattered more than volume. He nearly drowned once trying to swim across the East River on a dare, dragged under by the current and pulled out just in time. The scare rattled him, but it also lit something reckless and determined inside him. He began reinventing himself through names, a habit that would last years. GeorgeBurns came partly from his brother Izzy's name and partly from the Burns Brothers Coal Company, from whom he once stole coal to keep his family warm. He tried other aliases too, anything that might get him booked again when a theater owner decided he was finished. At 14, he ran away from home and joined a traveling stock company, chasing the stage with more hope than skill. His first paid performance ended in disaster when he froze, forgot his lyrics, and was booed off stage while pennies rained down on him. He was fired immediately. The humiliation burned, but Burns later called it the best lesson of his life. From then on, he wandered the Midwest, singing on ferry boats, in bars, on street corners, anywhere people might stop long enough to listen. He slept poorly, ate less, and kept going anyway. Failure didn't scare him anymore. It simply became part of the rhythm. By his late teens, he was forming and losing acts almost as fast as he created them. Partners left, money vanished, and trains carried him back to New York more than once with empty pockets and bruised pride. When World War I broke out, he tried to enlist in the Navy but was rejected for being too short. Instead of accepting defeat, he disguised himself as a woman and slipped onto troop ships as an entertainer, singing for soldiers while hoping no one noticed the deception. It was dangerous, illegal, and completely in character. Reinvention for Burns wasn't a strategy. It was survival. By the early 1920s, after years of drifting, he finally settled into the name George Burns and began working steadily in speakeasies during Prohibition, dodging police raids and hiding in coal bins when the law came knocking. One night, emerging covered in soot, he realized he needed something more than solo hustle. He needed a partner. That partner arrived in 1923 when he met Gracie Allen. She was Irish-American, soft-spoken, and possessed a mind that moved sideways in the most surprising ways. George initially planned to be the comedian while Gracie played the straight role, but the audience made the decision for them. They laughed at her confusion, her logic that twisted reality just enough to expose its absurdity. George recognized it instantly and stepped back, becoming the observer, the calm counterweight that let her shine. Their chemistry was immediate and undeniable. On stage, it felt like something organic had locked into place. By 1925, they were married, and their personal and professional lives fused completely. Contracts soon followed, including a binding agreement that required neither of them to perform without the other. Stability arrived, but it came with its own pressures. Gracie suffered from a heart condition that caused fainting spells, yet she continued performing through pain and exhaustion, rarely letting the audience see the cost. Together, they climbed vaudeville's highest peaks, headlining the Palace Theater, earning praise that compared them to the Marx Brothers. Radio transformed them from stage stars into national voices. By the early 1930s, millions tuned in weekly to hear Gracie's delightful misunderstandings and George's patient reactions. Their show felt loose, alive, almost accidental, and audiences loved it. Gracie's fake presidential campaign, complete with slogans and a kangaroo mascot, blurred the line between entertainment and reality so convincingly that some voters actually wrote her name on real ballots. Burns understood something crucial. People didn't just want jokes. They wanted to feel included. Behind the scenes, George was cautious where others were reckless. While fellow performers spent freely, he quietly invested in real estate during the Great Depression, buying foreclosed properties while the country panicked. When theaters closed and money dried up, those investments kept them afloat. It was the street-smart kid from the Lower East Side making sure he never went hungry again. Television brought another reinvention. The George Burns and Gracie Allen show invited audiences into a fictionalized version of their home, breaking the fourth wall in ways that reshaped sitcoms forever. Viewers felt like neighbors, not spectators. But beneath the laughter, private struggles persisted. George admitted years later to a brief affair that filled him with guilt. Gracie never publicly confronted him. Their marriage endured through forgiveness, humor, and an understanding that perfection was never the goal. As the 1950s wore on, Gracie's health deteriorated. She retired in 1958 and died in 1964, leaving a silenced George never fully filled. He kept an empty chair on stage for years, speaking to it as if she were still there. Audiences cried with him. Without her, his career faltered briefly, but he refused to fade away. He quit drinking and smoking for a time, rebuilt his act, and found a new rhythm as an older, reflective comic. Then, in his 80s, Hollywood did something rare. It rediscovered him. Winning an Academy Award for The Sunshine Boys at age 80 turned him into a symbol of endurance. Films like Oh God introduced him to new generations, his cigar now a signature rather than a vice. He worked through surgeries, injuries, and age with stubborn grace, performing into his 90s, joking that retirement was overrated. When George Burns died in 1996 at the age of 100, the shock wasn't that he was gone, but that he had lasted so long. His estate, worth more than $30 million, went not to his adopted children, but to charities, hospitals, and industry funds. To some, it seemed cold. To those who knew him, it made sense. Burns had spent his life giving laughter to strangers. In the end, he gave his fortune the same way. His influence remains woven into modern comedy. The pause, the understatement, the quiet confidence that lets the audience come to you. More than the cigars or the one-liners, that was his real legacy. a boy who slept in alleys, a man who lived past a century, and a performer who understood that sometimes the strongest joke is simply telling the truth and waiting long enough for people to laugh.